Psychological Interventions with Football Teams by Shelby Sparks. Football, also known as soccer, is historically one of the most traditional sports that was well known by many people all around the world. Since football is a traditional sport, structural changes are hard to establish, which means there is a big absence of a sport psychology figure. Most coaches and players have ignored its existence. In today's society, physical trainers are considered an essential part of football teams, but sports psychologists can be just as useful. Physical trainers work on tangible and extremely valued aspects of players' training, the physical part, while psychologists would work on more of the abstract area of their development, mental training. Sports psychology is slowly working its way into football teams' technical staff because it's becoming known to improve training. This chapter reviews all the unfavorable aspects which may facilitate the work of sports psychologists in this sporting discipline. This chapter is split into 4 different sections. First, the psychological peculiarities of football. This is to help recognize the keys for intervention with teams. 2. Basic recommendations for psychological demands of football. 2 most common demands are working with grassroots football, which is little kids, and working with elite football, which is professional. Number 3, psychological guidance with individuals involved in football, which indicates many strategies for guiding the different professionals involved in this sport. And number 4 is psychological intervention model for football teams, which represents a model showing an outline for sports psychologists working with football teams. Psychological peculiarities of football. Most football teams have the same routine for practices. The players arrive to the football pitch, go to the changing rooms, going out onto the pitch, training, changing rooms, and then leaving the stadium. Sports psychologists must be aware of the changing rooms in their work, because changing rooms separates the players from the coaches. Players talk freely and may make group decisions, creating distances from the coaches. So sports psychologists must be aware that anything said in the changing rooms has an amplified effect. A sports psychologist must also take competition times and different player positions into consideration to help them learn when and how to intervene. These are some of the most frequent demands arising in competitions. First, achieving the optimal arousal level to commence the match and maintaining it through the meeting. It's important for players to learn to perform in the best psychological condition from beginning to end of the match. Another demand is concentrating during the whole match. This is hard because matches last 90 minutes long. It's also important to learn how to increase and decrease concentration levels throughout the match. For example, a goalkeeper doesn't need to have 100% concentration when the play is on the opposite side of the pitch. Another one is the self-control needed when interacting with referees and rivals is also a big demand for football teams. Basic recommendations for the psychological demands of football. Sports psychology's focus varies depending on whether the intervention is directed towards beginner teams, which is grassroots football, or professional teams, the elite. Working with grassroots football, sports psychologists can't lose sight that they are working with children. They need to understand that parents can cause stress because of their standards of their child. Sports psychologists must work on this factor with the parents so it doesn't have negative effects on the child. A few characteristics of good players that sports psychologists should consider are control of arousal levels, high self-confidence, high focus on the task, and a greater confrontal capacity. Working with elite teams, training becomes the second concern because players are already really talented, but psychological aspects is the least developed area of the performance and needs to be most improved. Sports psychologists have to study each player because each player position should have different strengths and weaknesses. Having personal interviews with the players and holding small group meetings is a good way to strengthen necessary skills. Sports psychologists should also dedicate their time to developing strategies so that all members of technical staff contribute to the team's development. Psychological guidance with individuals involved in football. It is important for sports psychologists to be aware of the various strategies for working with each of these people: coaches, players, physical trainers, and parents. With coaches, the first thing sports psychologists have to do is find out what kind of coach they are: permissive, authoritarian, or democratic. Then there's two types of interventions: indirect and direct. Indirect is when coaches act as intermediary between sports psychologists and players. Direct is when objective is to improve psychological dexterity of coaches. For example, better people skills, like talking to the players or parents, stuff like that. With players, different positions should be considered. For example, goalkeepers and defenders register higher levels of anxiety because of the responsibility involved with their positions. With physical trainers, psychologists should explain how psychology can be used to optimize their work, and with parents, psychologists should teach them how to interact with their kids when talking about football. For example, instead of asking, "Did you win?" ask more questions like, "Did you have a good time? How did you play?" A psychological intervention model for football teams. This section of the chapter discusses some of the aspects to be considered in the psychological intervention with football teams, distinguishing those elements which are unique to football. There are two main aspects to be considered. First is psychological planning and elevation of the season. Psychological elevation within the traditional sport should make most of establishing collaborative links with coaches. The evaluation model used when commencing work with football has three functions: evaluation with the club, evaluation of the coach, and evaluation of the players. Then planning will take into account many factors. For example, figuring out at what point of the season should psychological treatment begin. The second aspect to be considered is psychological preparation of training and competitions. The two most common models are psychological work through the coach and psychological work with the team. Research. The first article is Mental Skills Training in Soccer, a Drill-Based Approach. This article presents an intervention program with a soccer team under the age of 17. The coach and a sports psychology consultant integrated training of psychological momentum into practice sessions. The intervention was initiated on a backdrop of a lack of history in the club for sports psychology, but also a historically poor season. Coaches had pinpointed that psychological momentum and reactions to adversity on individual and team level in matches and during training sessions as an area of potential improvement. In this study, they had 5 steps. First, preparation of the program. Second, areas of development. Third, working with psychological momentum off the pitch. Fourth, working with psychological momentum on the pitch. And fifth, long-term integration through coach supervision. For this team, the psychological intervention helped them improve. The second article, Psychological Momentum in Team Sport, an Intervention Program in Professional Soccer, is about how psychological skills training has been a tool used by sports psychology consultants. For football, these programs have been used as workshops, homework tasks, or individual consultants with athletes. The aim was to create an ecological intervention by creating a series of drill-based sessions to train psychological skills and educate coaches about how to implement and integrate psychological skill training as a natural part of daily training. In the 9 clubs that this study had researched on had success. These 2 articles are proof of how psychological interventions improve football teams. More coaches should use sports psychologists for their teams. Conclusion. Like many other sports, football has intense training and competitive structure, meaning psychological work must adapt to certain circumstances of each team or club. In recent years, football teams have been reluctant to allow the sports psychology profession figure to be a permanent member of the technical staff, even though their work has been proven to help teams. This is mainly because of the lack of information and traditionalism that sports psychologists would have to confront if they wish to work in this sport.